Hello and welcome to this special CNBC Africa broadcast. I'm Karima Brown. Since its launch in 2012, South Africa's National Development Plan has been touted as the country's long-term socio-economic development roadmap. The NDP is a policy blueprint for eliminating poverty, reducing inequality in South Africa by 2030. But are its targets in line with the developmental needs of the country, though? And what are the strategies for implementation? Joining me in the studio today to unpack these and other questions around the NDP is Trevor Manuel. He's South Africa's Minister in the Presidency responsible for the National Planning Commission. Also joining me is Professor Raymond Parsons. He's the Special Policy Advisor to Business Unity South Africa. And of course, we are also joined by Sdumo Dlamini. He's the President of COSATU. And then in the second half of the program, we will be joined by a studio audience who will have an opportunity to put questions to our panels. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Minister Manuel, I'm going to be starting with you. Of course, you have presented this plan to the nation, to Cabinet. They've signed off on it. Subsequent to that, there's been a lot of questions and critiques of the plan, particularly from some of the ruling party's allies, but also other ministers in government. How does the fact that very real criticisms have been raised impact on the implementation of the NDP?
I think that what's important about this kind of development is to set the objectives. And what the National Development Plan does is to set the objectives. That's the first thing we do. And setting this out 20 years is always very difficult because, you know, our imagination doesn't take us to a place we haven't been. And where we need to get to has to be measurable. It has to focus on what happens in the lives of people. And development is about what happens in the lives of people, of which a money measure is only a small part, but there are a series of other issues. And I know that a lot of focus has been on one chapter, the economy chapter.
Right.
But you've got to look at education, healthcare, access to public services, the space we live in, how we and where we find recreation. All of these are part of development. And so that's what the plan is. It's never set out to be a perfect document that has the ability to capture chapter and verse of every aspect of everybody's lives. We're a complex society. We are a country that has 11 languages manifested in our constitution. We are a greatly unequal nation. All of these have to be taken into account, and unless we start and make that commitment, we will not be able to move from where we are, and that's the problem. We can't wait for a perfect moment. We have to start, recognize where we are and start, and I think that's a basic message we need to get through.
Professor Parsons, let me bring you in here. Minister Manuel has explained the complexities of our society, but the comments that I hear from business people often on the NDP is that we are in a discussion paralysis. We're talking and talking and talking, and we never get to implementation. From Business Unity South Africa's point of view, is it time that we now agree and sign off on this plan and start doing, or do we still engage, particularly on some of the economic considerations and questions that have been raised?
Well, I think that the point of departure for business is indeed that the time has arrived that we need this kind of vision, which we need to translate into reality. And it's important also to bear in mind that from a business point of view, yes, we want an economy which over the next 20 years is going to be bigger, stronger, it's going to be better, it's going to do a lot more things. For that, we need this kind of roadmap. But one also must look in its context of saying to oneself, how many times have we been here before? And I don't want to take up time now. I can catalogue the number of times we have had all sorts of diagnostics and plans. And so forth. So what is the elephant in the room? It is implementation. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it's a perfect document, but we think as business it's a very good document. It's a very good basis to look where we want to be in say about 17 years' time. So the issue now is to finalize the areas in which there can be agreement and to get on with it. I mean, I'm looking at the introduction here by the Minister on the 11th of November of 2011. We're now halfway through about 18 months of this period. So really, I think that the message has to be, we've got to start both in the public and the private sector. There are certain responsibilities here for the business community, which has to step up to the plate. But let's look at the big picture, let's get on with it and send out a message that this is where we want to go, even if we don't agree on everything. In fact, in sort of lighter vein, when I'm seen walking around with this under my arm, I think it was a parliamentarian who asked me, well, is that your Bible? I said, no, just the New Testament.
Well, on that question, or rather on that note, let me bring in COSATU's President, Sdumo Dlamini. The time for implementation is now. COSATU has raised quite fundamental critiques of the plan, particularly its economic foundation. But within the Federation, there's different views. We've had the National Union of Metal Workers rejecting the plan wholesale, say it's a copy and paste attempt from DA economic policies, to other unions saying, yes, there are some good elements, but there's also some problematic elements. How long is COSATU going to be wanting to engage on the discussion issues? When are you going to start with wanting us to move forward, particularly if you consider some of the issues around unemployment, which ought to concern you as a federation?
Well, thank you very much, Karima, and good morning to my co-panelists and the audience. Look, I think I need to clear COSATU processes. When COSATU, after the NDP has been pronounced as the blueprint of government, COSATU in its internal processes say, let's prepare our response to that. And that's where you would have a range of our trade unions commenting as affiliates of the Federation, and they would come with their different positions. A process would then ensue where a COSATU position must emerge, collating all the views from all these affiliates. That process has now happened in the last week. We have a COSATU critique position on the NDP, which is indeed what COSATU has welcomed, the thought in South Africa for the first time for the country to say, let's have a plan so that we follow the plan, but let's try to get everybody agreeing on what the plan is going to be. I agree with Minister Manuel that one, it was not going to be a plan where everybody is together and agreed. Two, it was not going to be a perfect plan solely because we have drawn views from everybody, different people. Now, we have a position which is not a rejectionist position. We did not reject the NDP, but we did not wholly embrace the NDP. You would say we've taken a nuanced approach, so that we are not going to be a COSATU that isolates itself from the broader society on this very important discussion in our country. Indeed, in our view and our interest is that it should be able to show us its quick response to the immediate challenge we're facing right now. It should be able to talk to the fact that we now have the NGP as also a policy of government. We have IPEP 3 now, which is a policy of government. It has also to, for us, be seen to be defending collective bargaining in this country. I can say that there are many worries on the points that we've just made, and I'm happy that the minister will be able to clarify that, because the NDP has to be in sync with these policies of government. And more so, if you recall last year, the ANC comes out of its conference, it says this is the moment for a radical economic transformation in our country. Is it talking to that?
Let me pause there. Minister Manuel, does the NDP recommend radical changes to how the economy functions, particularly if you look at some of the structural impediments? Because that's where the differences and the debate seems to be lying, isn't it?
Karima, I think that what we need to do is to first focus on the objective. What the plan sets out is a commitment to full employment. And full employment we've kind of marked as an unemployment rate of 6% in this country, something we've never had because our unemployment is deeply structural. You've got to reach agreement on that. And I think that the point about the new growth path, IPAP, there would be complete convergence about the commitment to full employment. Once you understand and you agree on that, you've got to be able to analyze why we've got unemployment. And one of the issues is that our development path is out of sync with that which creates massive employment. Another issue is that our education system ill-equips people. And so we can't become a competitive economy because people leave schools with the wrong skills. You've got to fix the education system as part of this. I don't think that there's a dispute in government about these various programs, and you would have heard President Sdumo just last week again talk about the fact that the NGP embraces all of the other policies of government. What we haven't tried to do is to recraft. We haven't tried to find an alternative to the industrial policy action plan. We've accepted that. The plan will reflect that we've accepted that. There might be nuanced differences, but we can't sit around and wait for perfection. We've got to commit to implementation.
Minister, let me put this question to you. You're saying that let's look up at the objectives, but of course the big difference or the big point of divergence is the detail. We talk about youth unemployment, for example. The plan speaks specifically about how to get young people into the economy. We've had various proposals on the table to do that. We've had the wage subsidy, we've had the social accord, and of course that's where people disagree. What is the NDP advocating in very plain terms, no semantics? Does it advocate a youth wage subsidy? And if it does, how do you sell that to COSATU that's fundamentally opposed to it?
You see, one of the issues in society generally is that those of us who are inside try and keep others out. We have to persuade COSATU and everybody else that growing the number of people in employment does not risk the life of those who are in employment at the moment. That's where the issue is, and I think it's very important to recognize that government doesn't only represent the interests of those who are already in employment. The vast numbers of young people who are outside of employment need to be represented, and that is the responsibility of government within the social compact. The key issue about the youth wage subsidy is we don't know whether it works or not, but unless we are prepared to try things. And we can experiment. We could try this in certain provinces. We've had the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, Dr. Mkhize, say, why don't you try it in the province? And unless we are prepared to make that kind of commitment, we'll never know whether the idea will find resonance or not.
Mr. Dlamini, you take a different view, obviously.
Look, we ought to agree we must fix this disconnect from the initiation of the process of the NDP with its objective. You see, we can't say we will only see full employment 20 years down the line and accept that we're not going to see that because we're still trying to fix a problem. That's where COSATU will come from a different angle, because it's a monolithic kind of a myopic view to a problem. We have a problem now, and a plan that seeks to resolve that problem has to begin to show its visible attempts to fix the problem now. We begin now. It may take us 18 years, but we are on the path of fixing the problem. Now, if we are going to say, let's accept that we're not going to see full employment in the next 5 years from now, because we'll only see that in 2030. It's like saying South Africans or those who are unemployed should accept that they will never find employment now. They will only find the employment 20 years down the line. I think that's a problem. Secondly, the NGP the IPEP 3, and now the PICC. Very, very strategic, important interventions that government is coming up with, which talk and need to talk to the reindustrialization of our economy, the beneficiation processes. We should say, and I'm happy Minister Manuel says, it is important to begin a process to even talk to the current policy to be in line to begin to say how we're fixing the problem. We must be seen to be acting within the current policies, even if we are looking forward.
Mr. Parsons, the question of whether there's policy synergy is a big debate between the alliance partners, but business is not necessarily as energetic about the national or the new growth path and the industrial action plan. How does the endorsement of the NDP from the side of business set it up against the other important policy proposals that have been engineered by this government?
Well, I think the point of departure again must be that, and I think I've said this before, but really I think one must really try and make this warning, that if we could factor talking into our GDP, we would be the fastest growing economy in the world. And I think the worry is that if there are some people out there who are watching this program, who are unemployed, who are poor, they must be saying to themselves, but look, can't you reach consensus and get on with it? Because, as I said earlier, we can cite a number of times we've sat at this and other tables talking about these issues. And we come back to the issue, we must implement, even if it's imperfect, even if there isn't complete consensus, as long as you've got sufficient consensus. And I think there is consensus also that the situation has deteriorated. We had time before, we don't have time now.
Minister Manuel.
We really have to apply our minds to getting on with it and showing the nation that we are capable of mastering these issues.
When I spoke with you in December on the eve of the Mangaung conference where these policy issues were thrashed out, one of the big buzzwords was the question of trade-offs, and that the NDP speaks specifically to trade-offs where it accepts that we're not in a perfect situation and that some things will have to give. When some things will have to give, you require leadership, you need people to drive it. We've had NEDLAC processes stalling. We have people walking away from NEDLAC thinking that they've all won. And then, of course, when it comes to implementation, it falls flat because we actually realize that it's a fake consensus. Have we been having fake consensus, and is that the reason why we are still not implementing?
You know, what's important about the plan is that it's pretty pervasive, and we can be doing different things at the same time. One of the issues and why COSATU needs to be committed to this very strongly is that COSATU members and the poor in society are more dependent on public services. It's the children of the poor who don't have access to private former Model C education, which is why education is important. And that will be the determinant of whether parents can create that kind of expectation in the lives of their own children. It's the poor who use public health care facilities. We can be doing all of these things at the same time. And as we deal with them, I believe that we will be able to re-establish a necessary trust to deal with those issues that are not yet quite clear. And we'll find that implementation is not some cataclysmic event announced for someday. And I also just want to say to Sdumo, it's not the events of 20 years, it's about the implementation now. It's about trying out things and working for higher levels of employment now that will create full employment down the line.
I'm sure Mr. Dlamini has a response to you, but before we get to Mr. Dlamini, the South African Communist Party's analysis of your plan suggests that when you talk, for example, about the state being capacitated and building a strong state, that you can't just fast track to saying that the state has certain deficiencies without reflecting that the policy choices that were made back in '94, in fact, had an impact on the kind of state we have today and its ability to drive the very change. Talking, for example, about education. Why was education not free and compulsory in 1994, Minister?
Education was free and compulsory in 1994. The Schools Act, and the General Secretary of the Communist Party was actually the chair of the Portfolio Committee when the legislation was passed. He was a member of Parliament then. The legislation is clear, but it had always allowed an option for parents to add, which is why it allowed for the continuation of the Model C school. The compulsory education to age 16 was embodied in the legislation. There was a little difference because the Constitution has children up to age 18 and the Schools Act only had compulsory education to age 16. So beyond those little margins, it was there and has been in the legislation. It's not the legislation, just like it's not the plan or the Constitution, it's the implementation and how citizens are involved, not in waiting but in acting together. That's a simple message of the plan.
I wonder if I could bring in another variable which we mustn't overlook in our aspirations for the future. Now, in the plan, and I think it's agreed, that if you want to grow more rapidly, you've got to raise the proportion of investment, both by the public and the private sectors. And here, I think it's indicated that by 2030, we want to see that proportion at about 30%, which is high. At the moment, it's about 16 or 17, and in particular, the biggest part has to come from the private sector. What the private sector needs is an environment of certainty, that there is a plan, whatever adjustments are made as you go along, but the long-term goals are agreed, and we will align ourselves with that. There will be no U-turns, no shocks, no big surprises or unpleasant surprises. Given that there's a global situation we cannot do much about, but we must gear ourselves to be able to deal with it. Now, the important point is we need a commitment that says to the private sector, this is how the issues will unfold. Please invest, boost your investment, create the jobs, commit yourself in a way that is not happening at the moment. That's why, from that point of view, to have this shared vision of the future is a very important goal for the private sector to be able to align its decisions over the next few years.
Mr. Dlamini, what I want to ask COSATU is, it's in an alliance with the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. Let's, for example, take your union, the Municipal Workers Union, when it engages in discussions with a poor municipality on higher wages. How realistic is it to demand from a municipality that has virtually no ability to raise revenue, that perhaps gets a transfer from central government to function? How realistic is it to demand double-digit wage increases? Isn't it time that COSATU accepts the reality of the fact that you have responsibilities as an alliance partner to accept that there are certain limitations and that there ought to be trade-offs?
Look, I'll answer your question slightly differently and take you to our constitution, the country's constitution preamble, which took almost all the elements of the Freedom Charter. That preamble, equality for all, there shall be houses, there shall be education for all, the nationalization of minerals, blah, 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 all those things that are said there. The question is, if we have a plan in South Africa for the next 20 years, for the next 50 years, and does not relate to those principles in the preamble, how do you achieve those principles?
But with respect, Mr. Dlamini, that's an ongoing question. That's a perennial question. There's not going to be a perfect time when we agree on that. Shouldn't we begin to implement, as Minister Manuel has said, imperfect as the plan is?
Look, we're not opposed to beginning to implement, but if we are running a race, that is our destination, we can't start running and go the opposite directions. That is the destination, but I run this way, Manuel runs this direction. It's going to be a challenge. We will not reach the same destinations. Now, you are asking the question of the wage demands the workers are putting across, which is at the core of the point I make earlier, the defense of collective bargaining, which is a process that has got to deal with those issues and how the outcomes are being reached. Let's strengthen that. Let's ensure that there are proper platforms. If those workers in that suffering municipalities are making those demands, but we should also say, how much are you paying the municipality manager in that small municipality?
Well, Minister, let me bring you in there. The question of appropriate, remuneration for employees in the state. You've been very critical of the cadre of public servant that we have at the moment, suggesting that what we have is simply not adequate to implement this plan or many of the other plans that government have put forward. What needs to happen to overhaul the kind of person that needs to be working for the state?
I think that the leadership, and we're talking of implementation, I'm glad that a number of colleagues, ministerial colleagues, are actually leading the process. Minister Sisulu has been phenomenally supportive, and many of the initiatives that relate to retraining, re-equipping, relaying the basis for skills and accountability of public servants is in place. Just like Minister Khadebe the other day made that name and shame commitment to people involved in corruption. All of these are part of implementation. So it's not some future date. I think in many ways we're seeing the changes happen. But across the public service, I think that we must turn to our alliance partners in the unions and saying, along with the rights come the responsibilities.
Let's get that.
You see, unless the public servant who happens to be in a public sector union becomes the front line of development work, you can't actually have the transformation the country needs. Unless the educator who's in the class teaching the children of the poor says, I'm going to turn these children into star performers. They're not going to remain poor. Unless you have that kind of attitudinal change, you can't get a plan, you can't get the transformation we're speaking of. And that's where I think the rubber must hit the road.
I think another important point here on delivery.
Before
yes.
you make the point, what I want to ask you, Mr. Parsons, is Labour has been put under the spotlight. They've had to own up to some of the things that they need to give. So has government. Business is often let off the hook. It often speaks to a compact but walks away doing very little. Isn't it time that business also comes to the party and accept that the way in which they've conducted business, super profits, the kind of wages that they've been paying, simply is not sustainable?
Can I just start by saying that in this whole issue of delivery, we've got to think in a creative way how to mobilize the private sector so that you're not entirely dependent on the public sector, whether it comes to the party or not. And there are ways to do that through the public-private sector partnerships, which need to be expanded. It's not the whole answer, but I think we need to use these mechanisms. The second point is, yes, I think already under the new growth path, there have been half a dozen accords signed. And one of the important issues as we move under the umbrella of the NDP, we've got to interrogate how successful have those accords been, especially where there have been commitments by business. Have they been met?
Well, according to COSATU's estimation, they've not been very successful, particularly uptakes on companies in distress, for example, the processes that should be in place before retrenching workers. Business has simply not come to the party.
But we're now, because we've now had this experience for a couple of years, we are looking at those accords, because as we move into the bigger picture, what can we learn so they can be more successful in future? But coming back to the degree of consensus that you need, I just want to make the point also that unlike all the previous programs were virtually top down. The government thought up something, then came along and said, what do you think about it? So here, there's a great strength here, because it wasn't that Mr. Manuel went off with his 27 colleagues in a room and then came out after 18 months and said, well, this is what we think you should do. There was consultation every step of the way. There was a diagnostic document. All parties were asked to contribute. This is very much a bottom-up plan, which already does carry a degree of consensus. Now we've got to sign off on its implementation and make it work. because that's what the country wants.
Well, I see Mr. Dlamini's hands up to make another point, but we, of course, have to pay the bills here at CNBC, so we'll be taking a short break. But when we return, we will continue with our discussion on South Africa's National Development Plan. Don't go away.